Okay, so this is the first video lecture that I've done since they've installed the new Apple TVs in the classroom, so hopefully this is going to work. So we're starting with chapter 15 now, which is from the Baroque era, specifically music for chamber and church in the early 17th century, in other words, the 1600s. As we go back and we look at the way we categorize music, they would distinguish between the music for the church, music for chamber, in other words, music written to be performed and the estates of the nobility, small rooms for small audiences, and theater music, music written to be performed, opera specifically is a theater music. So secular works in concertato style, as we talked about in chapter 14, concertato style is when you have voices, either solo voice or a collection of voices that are accompanied by instruments. In this case, basso continuo. Basso continuo, of course, being a chordal instrument, usually a keyboard instrument, harpsichord or organ, or potentially a lute, and then a bass instrument, usually cello, maybe bassoon. Monteverdi wrote his last 4 books of madrigals. He wrote 9 books of madrigals total. His last 4 books are called concerted madrigals. In other words, voices accompanied by other instruments. This is something we didn't see earlier. If you think about all the Renaissance madrigals that we listened to and looked at, they were all unaccompanied voices. If an instrument was in any way involved, it was either doubling a vocal line or replacing that voice completely. So a new style comes along called the basso ostinato. The basso ostinato, also known as the ground bass, is essentially it's vocal. So it's voice with accompaniment. It's going to be in a triple meter or a compound meter. Remember, compound meter, triple division of the beat. So common compound meter would be 6/8, or a triple meter like 3/4. Usually it's a bass line that repeats over and over and over again, which is why it's called a persistent bass, an ostinato, a pattern that repeats over and over and over again. This repeating pattern was usually 2 measures, 4 measures, or 6 measures long. It's actually a very popular form, structure to be used, especially in arias during the 1600s. And we're going to listen to an example of ground bass aria, most famously Henry Purcell's When I'm Laid in Earth from the opera Dido and Aeneas. So, cantata. This is another one of those terms that actually changes its meaning over time. We're going to talk about the cantata specifically as a form used in the Lutheran Church, such as those that were written by Bach. However, that was not originally what it meant. First of all, cantata, cantare literally just translates as to sing, something to be sung. But the initial cantatas that came out in the 1600s started in Italy, and this was secular, so not religious music, solo voice with recitatives and arias accompanied by continuo, usually performed music for the chamber, music to be performed for small groups of the wealthy. The patrons who hired the musicians had these musicians in their employ. Barbara Strozzi was a well-known composer of cantatas, not as well-known because Barbara Strozzi was a woman, and in the 1600s, still, as we talked about in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, all the way up until today, women were not given the same opportunities and not taken as seriously as composers. However, she was supported financially by her father, by certain members of the nobility who financially supported her composition, and she did publish some of her own music. She wrote over 100 madrigals, arias, cantatas. She was actually a tremendously prolific composer. It helped that she did not have to make her living just by composing, because as I said, women, as I think I've talked about, maybe I haven't talked about that yet in this class, the highest position you could aspire to during the Baroque era was that of being a music director, being in charge of all of the music, either at a church or at a court for a very wealthy patron, and women, that was just not a position that was open to women at the time. Oratorio. This is another composition whose definition changes. As we get to the late Baroque, we'll talk about cantatas like Bach's church cantatas and oratorios like Handel's oratorios that he wrote in England. Having said that, the original use of the word oratorio was religious dramatic music that involved dialogue, so some spoken. It was either in Latin or Italian, and it included recitatives, so vocal solos, arias, duets, and instrumental preludes, and ritornellos. We'll talk about ritornello form when we get to chapter 18, specifically when we start breaking down concerto grossos of Vivaldi and Bach. Eventually, the definition of oratorio morphs somewhat to what becomes most familiar to us with Handel's oratorios. Still, at the time, the oratorio was a new form of music that developed in Italy during the 1600s. The oratorio, while it has a dramatic text and usually has some kind of a plot arc to it, it's not staged, so it's not like opera, no costumes, no sets, no staging. Also, oratorios used the narrator, which was a singing role, which is something that didn't happen in opera. Early opera never had a narrator. The leading composer of these oratorios was Carissimi. This is a composer who, quite frankly, while important in his day, is not heavily performed today. So we may listen to some Carissimi in class, time allowing, but we may not. Moving on, Lutheran church music. So Lutheran church music we talked about after the Protestant Reformation. We talked about this when we were talking about the Renaissance, how in the Lutheran church they wrote chorale melodies that were sung in unison and then were accompanied by the organ, and then eventually we get into the Baroque era and composers begin to harmonize, well, it started in the Renaissance, where they would do their own harmonizations of these chorales like a modern hymnal. However, other compositions became extremely popular in the Lutheran church as well. Sacred concertos, they're kind of in motet form, in German, because remember in the Lutheran church the service was celebrated in Latin. The most popular of these forms, the Historia, which is a musical setting of a narrative biblical story, and of all the Historias, the most popular form were passions. The Passion is the story of Jesus' crucifixion, specifically that story. And many famous composers have written passions over the years. Most specifically, as we get into the later Baroque, Bach writes two very famous passions. The Passion according to St. Matthew, and just colloquially known as St. Matthew Passion, and the Passion according to St. John? I may be screwing that up. So Passions is a setting, most popular type of Historia, which were a complete musical setting of some kind of a biblical narrative story. The most important composers of Lutheran church music during the early to mid-Baroque were Hermann Schein and Heinrich Schütz. Schütz actually studied in Venice with Gabrieli. Schutz's music, actually, he wrote quite a bit of instrumental music as well, which was strongly influenced by Gabrieli. And while he doesn't use the antiphonal effect that Giovanni Gabrieli used at San Marco in Venice, his instrumental music and his vocal music is still performed to some degree today. Schein, less so, but still, he's out there. His music is out there, I should say. I don't mean out there as in weird, I mean it's present. So, one interesting thing about the Baroque era is that instrumental music begins to become as important as vocal music. If you think about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, almost all the music we listened to was for voices. We get into the Baroque and instrumental music starts to become as important as vocal music, and then eventually surpasses vocal music. Having said that, a lot of the, especially earlier instrumental music in the Baroque period, borrows things from vocal compositions. Instrumental music tended to use basso continuo. So if it was written for a solo instrument, that instrument was frequently accompanied by basso continuo. If you ever perform any Baroque sonatas, be they flute sonatas or violin sonatas or cello or whatever, viola da gamba sonatas, Bach famously wrote six suites for unaccompanied cello, but he also wrote 6 suites for viola da gamba accompanied by continuo. So really the proper way to play these things is with a continuo, so a harpsichord or organ and a bass instrument. The focus, of course, was on the soloist, and you would embellish them. We've talked about this in class, the idea of adding your own ornaments to the music. That is the proper way to perform Baroque music of the period. So much instrumental music came out of this era that they actually had to figure out ways to classify all of this music, just to kind of organize it in catalogs and in historians' minds. So you can catalog it by performing forces. In other words, these pieces are all written for solo instruments, unaccompanied solo instruments, say keyboard or guitar or harp or lute. These works were written for a small group of instrumentalists, either a soloist with continuo or a small group of instrumentalists accompanied by continuo, and then larger ensemble works where you had multiple players on a part. That's one way you could categorize the music, by what numbers and types of performers were involved. Another way you could categorize the music was by the venue. Was this music written to be performed in church? Was this music written to be performed at the courts of the nobility? Was this music written to be performed at the theater? Or by nationality. That's maybe the easiest way. This music was written by Italian composers, this music was written by French composers, this music was written by German composers. Of course, there is some blending of international styles, so that's something to bear in mind. Or just the types of work. If we're going to categorize it by type of work, then is it a piece that sounds very free and improvisatory, like a toccata or a fantasia or a prelude? We will listen to examples of this. We're going to listen to a Frescobaldi toccata. Is it an imitative piece? Originally, Riccicaras, fantasias, capriccios are imitative pieces, but they kind of all blend together into the most complex of these imitative forms, the fugue, by the second half of the Baroque. Are these pieces that have contrasting sections, slow, fast, frequently with imitation? Canzonas and sonatas are examples of these. Are these settings of pre-existing melodies, like a chorale prelude, which is a free composition based on one of these chorale melodies? Is it variations, where we have a melody and we set a series of variations of that melody? Very common form, even to this day. Theme and variations, an incredibly common form. Or is it variations on a bass line, which, like the ground bass that we talked about earlier, the repeating bass line over and over, which we have someone singing on top of, we actually have a variation on that in instrumental music. Chaconnes, Passacaglias, Bach wrote a very famous Passacaglia in C minor, but it has a lot of the same characteristics. It's in a triple meter, it's a bass line that repeats over and over while things are added on top of it. Or are these dance movements not written to be danced to, but instead they are inspired by dance rhythms of the day, which you could have a single dance-inspired piece, you could have them paired up, or you could have entire suites of dance movements. And all these things we're going to break down as we move forward. So, now let's get into some more specifics. The Toccata by Frescobaldi. Frescobaldi, Italian, most important composer of toccatas, although quite a few Baroque composers did, including Bach wrote toccatas, written for keyboard instruments. Most of his music was written for keyboard. Toccatas, fantasias, which have similarities, Riccicares, canzonas, which are imitative, partitas, which are suites of dance movements. He also wrote some vocal music, but today Frescobaldi is far and away best remembered for his toccatas. Imitative, we talked about this. This is when you use one main theme and then you develop it by imitating it, like a canon or a round. And we've heard a lot of imitation in the music that we've listened to The Renaissance vocal music uses a lot of imitation. But this is an instrumental version of that. The ricercara, but eventually it sums itself up in the fugue. Fugue from the Italian word fuga, which means flight. They use the term fugue in Germany, really all over, France as well. In Germany, they might call them fantasias. And in England, they took the word fantasia and called it fancy. But fancy, the fantasia, the fugue, the ricercara, they are all imitative instrumental forms of music. And we will do a serious breakdown of a fugue. Chapter 19, I think. Music of contrasting sections, the canzona and the sonata. These could be multiple movements, where the movements are in different tempos and different feels, different emotions. Eventually, the sonata and the canzona just kind of fades away and the styles merge, and now they're all called sonatas. There are a ton of great instrumental sonatas written in the Baroque period for either, if it's for a keyboard instrument, then it's just for a solo keyboard instrument, or if it's for another instrument, then it's accompanied by continuo. And of course, to this day, people have continued writing sonatas through every era up until today. Settings of existing melodies. Organists would take chorales, pre-existing chorales from the Lutheran Church, and then they would compose new settings of them, sometimes rather involved settings. These became known as chorale preludes. Popular in the Baroque, other people wrote them even later. Brahms wrote chorale preludes in the Romantic era. And then also variations, where you take a theme, take a pre-existing melody, and then you repeat that melody and change something about it, and then repeat it again and change something else, and you keep repeating that melody, but changing something about it. If you were to do a structural graph of that, it would be A, A1, A2, A3, A4, etc. Because you're repeating the pre-existing melody, just changing something about it. And then finally, dance music. This is music that could be written for actual people to dance to, or it could be chamber music that was written inspired by these dances. So not intended to be danced to, but utilizing some of these dance rhythms. All of these forms, this chapter is kind of an overview. All of these different forms of instrumental music we are going to delve into more deeply in the ensuing chapters. We're going to listen to suites of dance music. We're going to do a breakdown of a fugue, a structural breakdown of a fugue, and analyze a Bach fugue. We're going to, in the class after this lecture, we're going to listen to and look at a Frescobaldi toccata. So this is just kind of the rise of instrumental music in the Baroque, specifically in Italy and Germany, but also, remember the beginning part of the chapter, the rise of this accompanied vocal music in the early part of the Baroque, which continues to develop, as I mentioned, and as we go on. Okay, so this is the end of our chapter 15 lecture. There will be an accompanying homework assignment, and then in the next class we will listen to examples of these different kinds of music.